Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Nutcrackers, A Colorful History. You may never have given those funny painted statues much thought, but the history of Nutcrackers involves the development of tools from the Stone Age to the Industrial Age. Their story encompasses the political changes of communist-era Germany, a Russian ballet, and American G.I.s. These are all elements in the history of these charming, colorful creations we enjoy today. Our look at Nutcrackers will include a nod to other traditional Christmas decorations, such as pyramids and smokers that have been developed alongside them. And today's presentation is led by art historian Mary Woodward, who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator and educator at the Concord Museum. Mary has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has over 40 years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James K. Polk. And we again thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the other 10 libraries who are partnering with Tewksbury for today's event. So all 166 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you. And hello, and thank you everybody for joining us. I want to thank Robert in particular at the Tewksbury Library for extending the invitation to join you again today, and for everybody who's with us today. Thank you so much. We're going to look, as Robert said, at the history of nutcrackers, smokers, and pyramids. And just bear with me as I get the slides changed. There we go. And you can see an example of each of those there. As one author notes, nutcrackers, with their different characteristics of style, often radiate the spirit of the time in which they're used. Only in connection with the historical and cultural currents of their time can they be appreciated and understood. And you can see these new ones right hot off the assembly line, COVID-19 workers, and there he is, King Charles. Nutcrackers, as we'll see, take all kinds of forms. Many of them take animal forms, from animals you'd expect to be cracking nuts, like those squirrels over there, to those less expected to crack nuts, like the alligators and crocodiles that we have there. Maybe it was the large jaws that inspired those creations. Humans, of course, have been the most frequently represented. And these representations run the gamut, from exaggerated caricatures to realistic faces. Even though we're going to explore a variety of types of nut cracking tools today, one thing is certain. The most frequent form, the form we're most familiar with, that is of a person whose mouth opens by moving a lever in the back, that form of a nutcracker was established more than 500 years ago. But first, we're going to have to go back even further in time to answer the question, when did humans begin to eat nuts, and how did they eat nuts? After the last ice age, which was about 10,000 BC, after that ended, humans began to settle down in different parts of the world and farm crops. And it seemed that hazelnuts were very much a part of their diet. At a Mesolithic, or that's a Middle Stone Age site off the coast of Scotland, which is not this picture, we'll get to that in a second, off the coast of Scotland, dated to about the same time, 6000 BC, archaeologists found a large-scale nut processing evidence. They found hundreds of thousands of hazelnut shells found at a settlement that these ancient people had lived in. Apparently, all of those hazelnuts were harvested in the same year, which tells experts that that's a group activity that was going on. This is a photo of a similar time period, about 7000 BC. It's a recreation, obviously, of a Mesolithic campsite in Ireland. Walnuts first came from Persia and entered into Europe about 400 BC. these ancient people, what were they doing? Well, they could crack the nuts and eat them, of course, but they were also grinding the nuts into a flour. They were using the oils to cook with, and unshelled nuts made a good food source that would keep for long periods of time. So it was important as in the evolution of people that they began to farm, and they began farming early on with nuts. You might ask, how did the ancient human people crack nuts? And the answer is they crushed them with their jaw. Now, our ancestors had bigger jaws than we do today. But they also did discover, and as evidence of, they discovered that they could roast them and make them pop open if they put them in fires. Now, there are three different kinds of tools that we're going to talk about, simple tools. And as humans developed, the tools developed for cracking nuts. So aside from the jaw, they actually developed simple tools. And these are three types: the percussion tools, the lever tools, and the screw tools. So we're going to look at each one of these in turn, and we're going to look at some historical examples of each as we go along. Percussion is simple enough. It means hitting a nut with something heavy against something else that's heavy. And stone was the obvious earliest kind of nut cracking tool. Archaeologists call them nutting stones, and you can see them here. One has a small depression where the nut would be, and if you know these scientific terms, that is the anvil. And then a human would strike it with a heavier stone, that would be the hammer. So nutting stones like this are found in archaeological sites. These happen to be from the middle section of the United States, and you can see the date there. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, these were used, and you can tell from the indentations that they were used over and over again. If you had a good nutting stone, I bet you held on to it. Now, the next type of simple tool is a lever. And we're most familiar with this form because it's what we pretty much use today. Lever-style nutcrackers must certainly have developed from other types of tools like the pliers or pincers. And they certainly bear resemblance to other tools that would be in people's lives, like blacksmithing tools, fireplace tools. Lever tools can be indirect or direct. That's depending on where the fulcrum is. And so indirect means that the nut is cracked over there by the red arrow. The nut is cracked on the other side of the fulcrum from where your hand is. And if it's a direct device, that means that the nut is crushed between your hand and the fulcrum. Now, Aristotle, we know, wrote about a lot of things and was interested about a lot of things. And in the 300s, Aristotle wrote a book about, he mentioned nutcrackers in a book that he wrote about mechanical problems and their solutions in a book he called Mechanics. From southern Italy, there are two amazing examples of nutcrackers from ancient times, both in the shape of hands and both dating from this one from the 400s BC. Beautiful, and you can see its size, about 5.5 inches, beautiful nutcracker in the shape of two hands. And here's the other one, a little younger, a little more recent, dating from the 300s BC. Both of these are made of bronze, and the fulcrum where you would use the device, the fulcrum where it's hinged, is right in the middle of the hands. And so we can't see it. The hands work as the handles or the levers. As you're looking at this, I just want to point out the sweet little gal there who's holding on to those. We're going to talk about her towards the end of our discussion today. So that's the ancient world, and there are two of these amazing examples of these amazing nutcrackers to look at. Now, from the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, there's written reference to a particular silver pair of tongs to crack nuts that were made. The tongs were made in 1372 and given to the wife of the King of France. Now, we don't know, these are not hers. We don't know what her silver nutcrackers look like, but I imagine that they were close in shape and form to this iron example that we have here. And many of these examples of metal ones, especially from France, and there are a few of them that we can share today, have loops at the end of their handles, in which you would tie them on to your belt, for instance, along with a good pair of keys, a pair of scissors, a knife, perhaps. So you would keep them handy, and that's what those loops could be for. But it's far more beautiful than just a rudimentary tool, isn't it? They decorated them with animal shapes, with designs, and including these little faces at the end. So there's always been, I think, a bit of whimsy about nutcrackers. Now, levers could be also made out of wood. And the earliest one in an American collection dates to 1569. It's this one. It's made of French boxwood. It's about 11 inches tall, and it's thought to portray the Francis I, the King of France, while Henry VIII was king, to put it in the time period. Look at the top of his head. On top of his helmet, there's a squirrel, isn't there, holding a nut. It's an amazing piece. It's exquisite. And happily enough, it's not the only survivor in the world, because there's a German collector who has this one. It's dated 3 years earlier by its inscription, and it's described as the head of a Roman. Now, my guess would be that these two pieces must come from the same workshop, and possibly even the hand of the same master carver working in France almost 500 years ago. Now, some of you have joined me in the past, I hope, for my Cabinets of Curiosities discussion. We talk about the fabulous tools and artwork and collections of natural history that were gathered during the Renaissance. Well, a beautifully carved item like this, a tool like this, would most certainly have found its place into someone's cabinet of curiosity. If there's something else that I want to mention that these two have in common with one another and with many of the nutcrackers we'll see coming up, and that is that both of these figures are people of importance, especially, of course, the king. It's an important aspect of nutcrackers that we see going on for centuries, and that is that the people represented are often figures of authority. Now, the early designs had the nut actually being cracked in the mouth of the figure, but it's such a delicate carving that eventually they discovered that they would make the lever crack the nut in the back. And so I've put on that slide on the right, you see the red arrow, you see that section between the two handles. That's actually where the nut cracking would take place, so that you don't destroy that beautiful carved face. Even so, with this, you may be asking yourselves, because I was, how would a nut fit in there? I can't think of how a regular nut that we're familiar with would even fit in that space. And the answer is easy and historical. Nuts were much smaller than in centuries past than they are today. Today's agricultural processes have made them grow much bigger. So before we leave levers, I just want to show you two examples from England. This one is just charming. It's conveniently easy to date because they carved the date of 1669 on it, and presumably the owner's name, George Bannister. He's missing his nutcracker. It's made of English yew wood, and it has carvings of a fox and a swan and a monkey and a man and birds. It's wonderfully created, it's animated, it's whimsical, it's charming. And in England, they also in England rather, staying with England, they developed a special type of lever style tool called a mortise style. And it meant that the levers weren't fixed with a single fulcrum, but could move. They could expand in order to accommodate different size nuts. The top lever is free to move within the slot on the L-shaped lower lever. These were popular from the 600s to the 1800s. And if it looks like a familiar tool that we'd be able to use today, well, we would. We're all familiar with adjustable pliers, right? It's really the same technology. So we're finally going to get to the third kind of simple tool, and that is the screw type. It had some advantages. It applies an even amount of pressure, and so you can have more control and you can save more of the nut from just crushing it into smithereens. And because there's less brute force, this one's made in England, by the way, 1631, also dated, very convenient. But also because it takes less brute force, they could make them out of other material besides heavy material like wood or metal. So there's a delicate, beautiful metal one from France, and you can see how it works. You just turn the screw into the chamber until you get that nut cracked. They also made them out of porcelain. They could make them out of ivory, and well, they're still making them today. I was going to say they make them out of mushrooms, but just to see if you were listening, they are still being made today. So I don't know about you, but you might be asking yourself, why did we need so many different types of nut cracking tools? And this one answer, simplest answer, is that people were eating more nuts, perhaps, than we do today. And they needed to do the shelling and the cracking themselves. They couldn't run to the store and buy a bag of shelled pecans, so they had to get about the business of doing it themselves. And nuts were sort of a bigger deal in culture and in their diet than they are today, perhaps. For instance, in medieval England, there was a time in the fall to celebrate harvests with festivals, roasting nuts, eating apples, big fire and festivities, but they called the celebration Nutcracker Night. So it was a bit more involved in society than we might think of today. Now, staying in England, though, we're going to look at Shakespeare's time. Nuts were eaten at theaters the way that we eat popcorn today, one author notes. When an archaeological dig in London in 1989 uncovered the well-preserved remains of the Rose Theatre, which had been built 300 years earlier, they found large amounts of walnut shells, hazelnut shells, and almond shells. Now, we happen to know that there was a food stand at the theater, and I believe that that's reconstructed in this image over on the left there, because the catering contract for the individual to supply the nuts to the theater, that catering contract still survives in the records. Now, in Victorian times, fruit and nuts were served at the end of the meal as a popular dessert. And now soup was served at the beginning of the meal. So the phrase "from soup to nuts," we know refers to the whole duration of something, but it's based on their actual meals. So now that we've looked at the technology for cracking nuts through the ages, let's turn our attention to the development of the wooden nutcrackers as we know them today. What was the inspiration for the brightly colored, sometimes exaggerated figures of nutcrackers? Well, as we've seen, they've been carved into human figures since the 1500s and probably earlier. One author named Adolf Heidenreich thinks that the colorful, slightly gaudy ones that we're familiar with today can trace their development to the period after the European Renaissance, to the period we call the Baroque and the Rococo, where instead of the peace and the restraint and the calm of the Renaissance, the period that follows was a period of discord and exaggeration in art and theater, in music and in architecture. And it's that period that we think was the inspiration for much of the Nutcracker styles that we see today. So let's do a little map skills. If you've been with me before, you know I love to use a map. Here's a map of present-day Germany, and the area in brown, right in the middle, is the Thuringia, and pardon me if you're German, for my pronunciation, but that region in brown is where the first lathe-turned wooden lever-style nutcrackers were being produced. And in that area, they had a habit or tradition. They built up a tradition of adding more lifelike features to the wooden creation by using a dough made of flour and water and some glue. We might call it paper mache, but it's similar to that. And they've built up the facial features. They've made it a little bit more to appear more lifelike. And there he is from 1820, Napoleon. But in the part of Germany that is most closely associated going on with the history of nutcrackers, and we'll look at the map again, is the Erzgebirge region, the Ore Mountain region, and that's near the Czech Republic, and that's in mint green to the right on your map. There's a little town there, not on the map, called Siphon, and Siphon was founded in the 13th century as a mining town. And in ancient times, people were mining tin, and then in succession, they mined silver there, and then gold, and then ores like copper and iron, cobalt in the 19th century, and even uranium in the 20th century. So it's always been a mining area there in the eastern part of this map. But it's the period of the 1600s that we're going to talk about as the beginning of the kind of nutcrackers that we're looking at. As the ore resources began to be depleted, and before the next kind of ore was discovered, the men in that area began to turn their woodworking skills into, they began to look for other ways to make money, if you will. They knew how to do woodworking, they weren't mining as much, and with the introduction of the lathe, as I mentioned, first it was foot powered, like those good old fashioned sewing machines, and then they became water driven. The woodworkers began to, build new things, make new things, and nutcrackers, wooden nutcrackers was one of the things that they began to make. Now, since many families in the Erzgebirge region of the Ore Mountains, since many families were having the same type of experience, needing to make something to sell and making wooden nutcrackers, they couldn't very well sell them to one another. How many do you need, right? And so what they needed were traveling merchants to take them to the big market towns and sell them. And they took them to places like Nuremberg, which is in the pale blue section of the map, and Dresden in the mint green section. We know that from the mid-1700s, nutcrackers from the Erzgebirge region were making their way into the markets in those larger towns. And by the mid-1800s, we have this fellow whose name is listed here, Wilhelm Feuchtner, who's known as the father of nutcrackers, making the first commercially produced nutcrackers. In other words, he was making them in a large enough volume to sell at those big markets. His tended to take the form, as you can see here, of kings and soldiers. And that's what you see right here. These figures dated from about 1880 and about the size and shape of nutcrackers that we could see today. There are different theories among the authors who study nutcrackers. There are different theories as to why they seem to take the form of authority figures. And remember, we were looking at that from ones made in the 1500s. Now, 300 years later, we have soldiers and kings again. And the theory among these researchers is that most agree it was a way for an ordinary person to make a higher ranking figure work for them by doing some menial labor like cracking nuts. Now, the next step after these authority figures was to produce figures that recognized and honored local professions like miners, firemen, chimney sweeps, foresters. So I offer you these pair of miners from the Feuchtner family. On the right, the older one from about 1880 of a miner, and more than 100 years younger, more recently made. The family is still creating them, and that's their modern version of the one from the 1880s. They're made now in lots of places. They're charming. They don't actually crack nuts, but who cares? We love them anyway. They're colorful and sweet. But now you're wondering, and we're going to get to it, how did Nutcrackers become associated with Christmas? And the story involves a popular children's book and an unpopular ballet. The children's book was E.T.A. Hoffmann's Nutcracker und Mausking König, the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, first published in 1816. It included a character of a soldier nutcracker. And many believe that Hoffmann took the inspiration from ones he'd seen at the market in Dresden, one of those big towns where the woodworkers sent their nutcrackers to be sold. And here is an illustration from the German illustration from the story. And here, you'll notice the difference is an illustration from an American publication of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, done just 2 years later. Hoffmann's story was developed into a ballet and set to music, famous music, composed by Tchaikovsky. The ballet was first performed in Russia in 1892. The music was a huge hit, but the ballet was not popular. One reason may be that it featured adults dancing in the roles of children. It also could have been that big scary nutcracker, I'm not sure. But fast forward to 1944. This is not, by the way, a picture from 1944, but I couldn't find one from 1944. So we're just going to look at a modern version. Fast forward to 1944, and the San Francisco Ballet in that year performed the Nutcracker. And the rest is history. It was, of course, as we know, hugely popular and remains so. One author named Malone says that the ballet became a favorite holiday tradition across the United States and helped make Nutcracker dolls a holiday tradition, decoration, and a seasonal icon across Western culture. Now, clearly, because the ballet is set during Christmas time and it prominently features the Nutcracker, the products quickly became associated with the holiday. So following World War II and the carving up of post-war Germany into different pieces, that actually led directly to two other aspects of the history of modern Nutcracker making, if you will. The first aspect is this, that following the war, East Germany, the former German Democratic Republic, was controlled by Russia, by the Soviet Union. And private factories there in what became East Germany were now taken over by the communist government. Some of the woodworking families in those eastern areas that we've been looking at on the map were able to escape to the West and continued their family businesses in West Germany. Once reunification occurred, some of those families moved back into their towns in the Erzgebirge region of eastern part of Germany and carried on their work. And one of those families is the Steinbach family. They're still making colorful nutcrackers and smokers and pyramids, which we'll see in a minute, as they have been for more than 200 years. The family was established in 1602, but they've been doing this for more than 200 years in the business. Now, even today, and clearly they offer them in sets, as you see here, and they would disagree with me when I said, how many nutcrackers do you need? The answer clearly is you need the whole set. So my apologies to the Steinbach family. Even with modern manufacturing process, it takes about 130 different procedures to make a nutcracker, even today. Some of them are still made in small family-based businesses by, say, the 6th generation of the family doing it, and others are made in large factory settings, but the process is the same. It's time-consuming with lots of fiddly little bits that go into it. And the classic wooden toy soldier remains the outstanding runaway bestseller still. The second outcome of post-war Germany that had an impact on Nutcrackers was the fact that U.S. soldiers were stationed in West Germany, and they began to bring Nutcracker dolls home with them as souvenirs and gifts. This led to an enormous popularity in the United States, and it coincided with the rise in the popularity of the Nutcracker ballet, as we saw from 1944 onwards. Well, now, of course, we can't go on without mentioning that there have been a few novelty styles to come along in history. Figures of women cracking nuts between their legs has been an entire genre, believe it or not, going back to the 19th century and probably earlier. But we have a 19th century example there in brass and a 20th century one there in teak. And it continues today with the more exaggerated and hilarious Hillary Nutcracker. So with the growing popularity of Nutcrackers, as long ago as about 1850, some German woodworkers began to expand their repertoire to include figures that we call smokers, in German, Rauchermann. They're incense burners, they're incense smokers, and we'll have to ask ourselves, how would you develop a smoking wooden statue like this? And it's been suggested by some researchers that the rise in this was partly influenced by the rise in actual cigarette smoking, that more and more people were smoking cigarettes, and what fun it would be, a novelty to have a smoking wooden figure. The woodworkers create a hollow figure that comes apart. There's a metal tray inside. If you're not familiar with the way this works, the incense cone goes in there, you light it, put the top back on, and the smoke comes out their mouths. Almost all of them have a little pipe in their mouth, so it looks as if they are really smoking. The incense that is traditionally sold along with these are holiday fragrances like frankincense and myrrh, gingerbread, and fir to set the mood. So that's smokers. Lastly, we'll turn our attention to pyramids, and not pyramids from Egypt made of stone, but pyramids from Germany made of wood. Wooden creations, multi-stories high, platforms with figures all rotating around a central post. There seem to be two historical traditions that have contributed to the development of Christmas pyramids or wooden pyramids like this. The first has to do with ancient midwinter traditions in Christianity, and the second has to do with the mining industry. The first goes like this. Ancient times, Germanic tribes living in that area of Germany had a tradition of bringing in evergreens into their homes during the winter. Well, obviously, evergreens were magical in their minds because they stayed green throughout the winter, where the other plants would die. And the Romans, who came along after this in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, well, they followed on that tradition of bringing evergreens into their homes during the period of December when they celebrated their Saturnalia holiday. Fast forward a couple of hundred years, and you have the English missionary Saint Boniface in Germany talking and preaching about Christianity to people, and he begins to use the evergreen fir tree in his preaching, and so that leads to the development of the Christmas tree. Now, people, once they had the Christmas tree, they began to build these wooden pyramids, which started as sort of tree-shaped set of wooden shelves upon which to put gifts of fruit or little wooden statues and to decorate with at Christmas. And now we have them in exaggerated, beautiful, large forms in public spaces and market squares in Germany and in some of the areas of the world where German immigrants and traditions continue, such as this one from Fredericksburg, Texas, built by craftsmen from the Erzgebirge region. Some researchers do point to a second tradition, as I mentioned, that's part of the mining history of the Ore Mountains that suggests that these wooden pyramids are related to the light stands or the racks that miners would bring into the mines with candles. If the candles stayed lit, there was plenty of oxygen for the people, but if the candles blew out, it would be unsafe for the miners to be in the mines. You can certainly see how this form might have come from that tradition as well. So in this year, happy to announce that the famous markets typically held in European cities and particularly in German towns are back. Nuremberg's market started about 1530, but the one that claims to be the oldest is Dresden's market. And you can see a picture of it here from a previous year. This year, Dresden is celebrating the 588th Christmas market. They had to take a few years off during the COVID pandemic, but they're back up and running right now. So you still have time to get there. They run until Christmas Eve, most of them. Now, if you're not intending to travel that far that quickly, there's a place you can go that's closer to us, somewhat, maybe. I'd have to do the mileage. It's continental US, where you can go to a lovely alpine village full of nutcrackers, and that's Leavenworth, Washington. It's the home of the Leavenworth Nutcracker Museum, the creation of Arlene Wagner. She's the wonderful lady who was pictured earlier holding the little bronze ancient nutcracker hands. She's a self-described nutcracker lady and the ruler of the museum, no doubt. They offer displays, educational projects, and a comprehensive history at the look of nutcrackers. I've included their website as well as Steinbach's and a number of others on the list of references that I've given Robert. So as we end, so much more than just a pretty face or a colorful holiday decoration. Yes, nutcrackers, smokers, and pyramids do have long and colorful histories of their own to tell. And that, as they say, is it in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
I see what you did there, Mary. So Mary, thank you so much. Wonderful job. So folks, at this time, if anyone has any comments or questions, feel free to get them into the chat in the Q&A. We'll take roughly 10 or so minutes of questions and comments, and then we'll diverge into show and tell for those who want to stick around. Let me read some comments here. Rachel says, thank you so much. Celia says, thank you from Richmond, Virginia. Nancy says, this was so fun. Debbie says, I loved this. So again, folks, if you have any comments or questions, Makey says, thank you, very interesting. Roland said this was a lively, informative presentation. It was most enjoyable. Denali says, thank you, lovely presentation, wonderful, colorful slides. Frank says, fascinating. Janine says, I loved learning more about the snowman smoker.
Yeah.
Julie says, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, let me go ahead and I will share that. First of all, let me explain this funny picture on your screen right now. Yeah, that's me playing around at Michael's during COVID restrictions, when happily for me anyway, and maybe some of you shared this, Michael's was considered essential to stay open. And I went in Michael's craft stores quite a bit, but for some reason I felt possessed to stand there like this with the very tall nutcrackers. But I wanted to share, I'll go ahead and share this one. And if people want to think about what they might want to share, go ahead. This is our smoker. This is one my husband bought, Santa there with his pack of goods from a market, I think in Nuremberg, Germany, one Christmas in 2014. And this is me coming clean. This is us coming clean with our silliness. So my husband brings this beautiful wood sculpture home. He told me that when he was in the market buying it, he doesn't speak a word of German, not one word. And he was having a great time. And he zeroed in on this one. This was the one he wanted. And the person at the market stall tried very hard to sell him something else. And he had to be polite and insist that no, all he wanted was the wooden statue of Santa. Thank you very much. And so off he went with his wooden statue. And I have to tell you guys that it was several years, really, really several years before I realized that it was a smoker, that it came apart. So right around his tummy, the thing just pops apart. And what the poor person at the market was trying to sell this American tourist was a box of incense cones to go in the smoker. But he just didn't understand what was happening. So happily, thanks to the internet and the World Wide Web, we can buy anything in the world. I could go online and not from that market seller, of course, but I could buy a package of nicely fragranced incense cones. And now we enjoy our smoker the way he was supposed to be enjoyed. But we do have a laugh at ourselves for how many years we went not knowing what it was we had. So there's my story.
Janine says, yes, the same thing happened to me. And I wound up putting some incest coins and still use it today.
Yes.
Smiley face. Martha says, Mary, my friend Martha, who we'll see next week. Mary, thank you for such an interesting history of nuts. Thrilled to know where From Soup to Nuts comes from.
Yeah, now we know.
Yeah, now we know. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, I was just going to say one of the other phrases when we say something was in a nutshell. That actually, one author says, comes from Celtic legend that says a nut stands as a symbol for concentrated wisdom. A nut is something sweet, compact, nutritious, and enclosed in a small, hard shell. So as we speak of truth being in a nutshell, so that's the origin, apparently, of that phrase as well.
Julie says, thank you. I learned so much. Zygmunt says, thank you from Jacksonville, Florida.
All right.
Cynthia says, this was a lovely presentation. Thank you and happy holidays. Deborah says, well done. Teresa says, I learned a lot. Kathleen says, this was excellent. Eileen says, a fantastic education for one and all. Claudia says, excellent. Now we have some questions here.
Okay.
First question comes from Catherine. What is the German name for Nutcracker?
Oh, it must be Nut something. Gosh, good question. Wait, hold on. It's in my, let me look here and see, because I wrote it in Nussknacker. Nussknacker? Nussknacker, Nussknacker.
All right, there we go. An anonymous attendee asks, since the smokers were made of wood, did they sometimes catch on fire?
Not yet. No. You know how incense is. You have to blow on it until there's not an open flame. I will tell you that I'm very careful with mine. I don't go to bed with Santa smoking incense in the next room. So there's a big chamber in there. I should have taken a picture of mine apart. And honestly, about 4 minutes before we were to start today, I thought, I'll go look for it. No, I'm not going to find it in 4 minutes. But there's a big chamber in there. All of the red part of his body is pretty hollow. But I don't leave it burning. This is true.
Patricia says this was very enjoyable and informative. Jody says this was fascinating. I can't wait until I go to Leavenworth to see the museum.
Yes, no, it's amazing. And she seems like a fabulous person who's a personal crusade of hers her whole life to do this. And happily, as she nears retirement, they've already designated the Nutcracker lady in waiting. And so there's another person to take over, but it seems like lots of fun. And apparently in the 1970s, Leavenworth, Washington, remade itself over as a sort of alpine looking town as a tourist thing, but it's working.
Kay says, I'm going to Leavenworth for my grandson's wedding, and now I will be and she's going to add the museum to her list of places to visit.
Absolutely. Oh, do. Oh, that would be great.
EE says, where can we find this recording? I just joined, so I missed much of the talk. So EE, I will send the recording to everyone who registered via email later this afternoon. And the email will also include the resources or reference list that Mary cited a couple of times. And there'll be information about some other upcoming virtual art history programs and virtual holiday themed programs that we're hosting this month. A couple more questions before we get to show and tell. Robin wants to know, Mary, how many Nutcrackers do you own?
Oh, good question. Personally, really, I don't own any, but I have my mother's collection, and she must have about a dozen or so. I have the one smoker here, and I don't have any pyramids. So clearly, I need to go to Germany and buy one. Yep.
And so, folks, before we get to the last questions, if you would like to show the audience your Nutcracker, I'd like you to do one of two things. You could either raise your virtual hand, or you could type in the chat that you would like to do so. And I will promote you, quote unquote, that's a Zoom terminology, but I will allow you to be seen and heard by the audience momentarily. So if you're interested in doing that, you can either raise your virtual hand, which I see a few folks have done, or indicate in the chat. All right, so we'll get back to a couple more questions. Carol asks, oh, my old friend Carol, I hope retirement is treating you well, Carol. Carol asks, do they make tabletop versions of the pyramids that you can buy?
Yes, absolutely. But what you often see are ones made of metal these days, and sometimes these are associated more with Scandinavian Christmas traditions, but they have little candles that you can light, and the heat of the candle makes the little metal pieces turn, so you can look for those. But yeah, they do make tabletop ones. There's a shop in Connecticut, oh, I didn't put that on the list, that has all kinds of Nutcrackers, but yeah, and pyramids. They do make tabletop versions. You do not have to have a 46-foot high pyramid in your backyard.